My name is James Baldwin. I am managing editor at SAGE. I have about 10 years experience in academic publishing and in editing journals and choosing papers to publish. So I'm hoping to bring some of that experience to help you today. So what we will talk about is, firstly, we will talk about interesting subjects in engineering, hot topics at the moment, and how that relates to relevant SAGE journals, and what are things one might consider researching or learning around in order to broaden your knowledge. Then we will have a look at how academic publishing and journal publishing in particular works, how a paper goes from submission to potential publication. Then after that, we'll look at how to get through that process. So how to choose a journal, how to write your paper, how to communicate with editors and with reviewers, and we'll cover briefly some ethical concerns or issues that one might need to be aware of and to avoid. And then we will summarize what we have covered. Okay, so to begin, these are some selected hot topics in engineering, from mechanical to materials, electrical, and biomedical subjects. It's a big, broad area, and it's very interesting and it's very exciting. And we'll give some examples of papers in these areas from SAGE. So, to begin with, the first subject I might consider at the moment being particularly hot is Industry 4.0. So the next revolution in manufacturing in particular, so smart systems. But it also connects with the Internet of Things, which is developing quickly now that so many people are connected to at least some kind of smart device. And that kind of research we're publishing a lot at SAGE and is being published across the world. And the Internet of Things itself connects quite nicely with smart cities, which is around urban areas in particular being connected with a view to making it easier, safer, things like that. And a review of this can be found in the above paper here, a complex view of Industry 4.0, which gives a broad overview of the subject. Next, we mention power and energy. So obviously the world is going through climate difficulties, and there's problems with generating power and energy efficiently and cleanly, and this has really become one of the big concerns of the planet, and is a major focus of engineering. It's where engineering can make a big difference. So generation of power is I guess the first place to start, and the distribution of that power and energy. We have an example here of a good piece of research in that area. Smart grids are also associated with distribution of power. They do it efficiently and connected again to the Internet of Things and things like that. Storage is perhaps actually the most significant problem facing the world at the moment, and perhaps the safer or the quickest route to a more efficient world is efficient or effective energy storage. We have published a really interesting paper on energy storage, an example here in oceanographic vessels using interesting fuel cells, but that kind of process is appropriate to anything, particularly near the sea, and semiconductor technology has continued and will continue to be extremely important in power and energy. physics. Biomedical engineering is a universal concern, of course, and personalized medicine is getting more and more feasible and more useful as technology improves. Medical imaging will always be extremely significant. The ability to see inside bodies or body parts, I suppose, without being invasive, without hurting the patient, and to get diagnoses quickly will always be important. And we have published an interesting article here on magnetic resonance imaging. And prosthetics are developing quickly, but with the development of robotics, that avenue of research is extremely rich and extremely rewarding and important. And penultimately, we have nanotechnology, which got a big boost about 15 years ago with the advent of graphene, but it continues to be exciting. You have devices on that level which exist in all of our technology, but also you have materials research in that area which influences greatly the devices side of it. Your device is only as good as the material you work with, and we publish interesting work in this, particularly in ceramics and woven fibers associated with nanoscale technology. Quantum technology I have left blank because I don't believe anywhere in the world has published anything particularly useful in terms of the actual application, but I think in the future that will be extremely interesting. The theoretical physics there exists, but actually implementing it is a real question, and I hope maybe one day one of you guys will, contribute to that. Finally, we look at smart materials. So these are applicable across all the things we've just mentioned. So earthquake monitoring and sensors is one particular example. And energy systems need smart materials that can adjust conditions. They can be tuned, they can sense in particularly intelligent ways, and actuators in order to control complex systems using smart materials are really important. So there are a few examples of subjects. There are plenty of these ones that I happen to think of at the moment, which are particularly interesting. And a lot of these papers that I've highlighted here, these subjects I've highlighted here, can be found they were all taken from these journals. So we have SAGE Open, International Journal of Distributed Sensor Networks, Wind Engineering, Journal of Engineering for Maritime Environment, Journal of Sandwich Structures and Materials, Prosthetics and Orthotics, Mechanical Engineers, Part N, Journal of Nanomaterials, Journal of Materials Design and Applications, and Structural Health Monitoring. Of course, there are plenty of other SAGE journals within these areas, but these are the ones I found particularly interesting. Okay, so they're the subjects that I think perhaps might be interesting to publish in, but what happens in publishing? So, an overview of journal publishing, the life of a paper. I can't tell you how to write I can't tell you how to do your research, but I can tell you how to write a paper and what happens to that paper. So let's look first of all at what happens to that paper. So, you, the author, will submit your paper. At that stage, it will go to the editorial office of the journal, where initial checks will take place. These are basic checks, where the spelling or the clarity of images, your references, they will be checked, and if there are problems there, the paper will be sent straight back to you, the author, and at that point you'll be able to rectify those problems and resubmit the paper. Once your paper has passed those initial checks, it will be checked by the editor, who will have a look to see if your paper is appropriate for your peer review. If your paper looks kind of interesting or of some value, or like it might be, the paper goes to peer review, where peers, colleagues around the world, will independently review the author's your work and make recommendations as to whether the work is worth publishing to the editor. The editor will then make one of several decisions and make the general, or the most common examples would be accept, where the paper would be accepted straight away, reject, where the paper would unfortunately be rejected for publication, and revision. So the revision is where the reviewers and the editor believe paper is, or potentially has value, but that it needs extra work. This may be further research, but it may be simpler problems such as presentation, English, quality of English, or a few tweaks to mathematics, things like that. That decision will be sent to you, the author. The author can then make those changes and resubmit their paper. If those changes are correctly done or implemented, the editor will make a decision, and the reviewers perhaps will then make a decision to publish the paper if those revisions are appropriate, and the paper will be accepted. Once it's accepted, there will be a period to wait before the paper is published, but it will be done. So that's how a paper goes through peer review. So I will now talk about how you can best write your paper and deal with the process in order to maximize your chances of being published. As I mentioned before, I cannot tell you how to do your research. I have to assume that your research is good. I cannot do that. If the work is not useful or not considered useful, then how well you write your paper won't matter too much. But assuming your work is of value, how do you maximize the chance of being published? Well, the first thing you need to do is select the right journal. There are a number of things to consider here, and they're mostly about the needs you as the author have. Does the journal fit the scope, or does your paper fit the scope of the journal? This is very important to the editors and to you. Are the length limits and the turnaround times, the peer review times, are they suitable for you? Does the impact factor, is it high enough, or is it an appropriate level for your work and for your needs? Are you likely to be accepted in the journal? This is where quality threshold. What is the quality threshold of the journal, or the novelty threshold of the journal? That's a better way to say it. Does the journal offer open access, and does it meet your funding requirements? So, first of all, scope. So, does it match your paper? This is important because if it doesn't, then the editors will reject it. Also, if it doesn't, even if it were to get accepted, the audience might not be interested, which means your paper will be reaching the wrong audience, which means it won't be cited, which means that you won't be furthering the pool of knowledge in engineering as you would like to, as your role sees. So consider the scope, make sure, and if you're unclear, you can always email the editorial office of the journal, and they will let you know. So you can tell them what the abstract of your paper is, what the content is, what the subject is, and they will let you know if it's in the scope. One other thing to consider is length limits and turnaround times. Is your work suitable for short letter publication? Shorter papers tend to be preliminary results. They're published quicker, peer review is quicker, but there is less room for discussion and detailed results. These tend to get cited quite highly, they're good, but they sometimes don't lend themselves to certain kinds of research. So ones where you need to give very detailed explanations of method, results, or mathematics would be more suitable for longer format journals, where there's more room for discussion and more detailed results. However, the publication time may be slower. It is something to consider. In the modern era of budgets and page budgets, this is less important, but it is something to consider. Impact factor. Now, this is a complicated thing, but it's considered a metric for quality of a journal. That the merits of that can be argued, but that is the way it is often considered. So, you may be required to publish in journals with impact factors of a certain level, in a certain quartile of impact factor. This is mandated often by funders. And is it high enough for your work? Make sure that you publish in a journal which meets your requirements of impact factor. Similarly, in terms of the novelty of your work and the citability or the publishability of your work, is your paper likely to be accepted? I mean, I myself have written papers and then submitted them to journals which were too lofty. It was unlikely my work would ever be accepted there, and it wasn't, and it was rejected because they were only really looking for the most novel, the newest work, and my work was not. So aiming too high could result in rejection. So be realistic. Is your work likely to be accepted in that journal? But do aim as high as possible. And if you are rejected from a certain journal, you can always submit somewhere else. However, you may have wasted time or delayed the publishing of your paper, and sometimes it's important to get these things published quickly. So make sure you aim at a reasonable level for your work. Finally, open access and funding requirements. Open access may be mandated by your funders. So, open access being where the author pays for publications, but then the paper is available to all for free. This is developing into, or it's believed will become the standard publishing model, particularly for academic publishing. And a lot of journals, SAGE journals in particular, offer options around open access. So even if a journal is not open access at its core, it will have open access options. They're always available, and make sure that you investigate those. Okay, so they are the considerations you have to make when submitting to a journal. And so we'll move on to the considerations you have to make when writing your paper. Now, this is obviously depends very much on the subject and the length of your paper, things like that. But there are certain rules are the wrong word. There are certain rules of thumb that one should follow. You should make sure that you stick as closely as possible to the following. So the first thing, and the most important thing I think I will say, is that first impressions do count. Often, very much the first encounter people will have with your work is just a cursory glance through. If they notice that the basics are wrong, like spelling and figures and tables, if they're unclear, if the text is unreadable, they will not be disposed well to your work. So, the very most important thing you can do, it sounds obvious, but I've overseen the peer review process of over 30,000 research articles, and you'd be very surprised at how many papers I see where the text is not readable, it's not spelled correctly, the figures and tables are unclear, The references aren't ordered sequentially. These things are quite easy to get right to an extent. Spelling is easy to check. Figures and tables, you can see if they're legible. Make sure you do those basic things correctly. And if you have a problem with the English or the spelling, it's always a good idea, and I do it myself, is to seek advice from native speakers and colleagues. If you don't follow these or get these basic presentation things right, your work will be rejected immediately, which is a shame, because if you've done some good work, it seems sad for your work to get rejected. But if you just make sure those things are okay, you'll move on to the next stage in peer review and it'll be fine. So another basic aspect of a paper is its structure. So generally an article has these sections. It has an abstract, an introduction, which I've noted here is the most important section, the method, the results and discussion, conclusions and references. And I also have included some examples from the paper from the International Journal of Distributed Sensor Networks. I have included a link to that paper too. So let's move on to that first section, the abstract. So the abstract should be or constitute a brief summary of your paper. It is not a discussion of existing literature, but it is a discussion of what you have achieved and a summary of protocols. It is important that this is clear and efficient, and I would advise you to write it last. It doesn't need to be complicated, it just needs to give people a very brief idea of what you have done. Here is an example. You'll be able to read this. I believe the slides will be shared afterwards. What they have achieved is clear. They haven't. It's not confusing around what they've done and why they have done it. The first major section of your paper is the introduction. Now, the introduction, kind of surprisingly perhaps, is the most important part of any paper. It's what people read first, and it leads people into what you have done. Now, I've highlighted here 4 points, which is that the introduction should place your work in context. It should explain why you have done this work, to explain why it is important and why the reader should be interested. As I've said here again, these are the most important things to get right in any paper. In the thousands and thousands of papers I have managed the peer review of, these are the most common reasons, or failure to achieve these things. It's the most common reason, for papers being rejected. So if you take nothing else away today, then you should take away the fact that you need to place your work in context. The audience and the reader need to understand why you have done what you have done. Give a history, explain there is, a gap in a certain subject which needs filling. There's apparent energy crisis in a certain aspect of distribution, and these subjects need addressing. And so other people, what they have tried, and why what they have tried is not quite good enough, and why you want to address that, and how you are going to address it. So once you have your introduction and explained and given a reason and motivation for your work, you need to then, here's the example of a nice introduction. They've given a nice example at the beginning as to what subject they're dealing with, low power wide area networks, why they're important, because they're a new trend in the evolution of telecommunication designed to enable a broad range of Internet of Things applications. Then they've discussed what other people have done, why that has shortcomings, and what they will then do to address those. Once you have introduced your work, you can then move on to the method you have used. This will also often include your results. You need to explain your starting point, the assumptions you have made. This is very important. Engineering, physics, mathematics, mathematics to a lesser extent, but they all require assumptions. No model is perfect, and you have to assume things about your system. Even if you're doing an experiment, you have to assume certain protocols, and you have to let people know what you have assumed, and thus what protocols you have followed. The technical details of your research, that can vary, but you need to be honest and you need to be clear about what you did and about what you discovered. So this can include mathematical formulation and derivations, but also what experiment you did, what technology you used, what devices you used. Make sure that people can, in a sense, repeat your results from reading your paper. So how you calculated and measured your results should be clear and repeatable by the audience. Here, in the example, it is clear what they did. They used, they've explained 3 practical experiments were conducted. In the first 2 setups, the performance of the real-life LoRa end devices under Doppler frequency shift were investigated. And they explained specifically what was done at each of those protocols. And then they explained the experimental setup with different parameters, and they went through systematically in order which ones they followed and why. Results and discussion. So you've introduced briefly your results in the previous section, so now you need to explain why they're important. So you need to tell people what you have discovered. You can display numbers in a table. You can have a quantitative or qualitative formula or equation. And you need to explain how this compares with the existing knowledge. Comparison is always important. You need to compare your results with what people have done before. Otherwise, people won't understand why what you've done is interesting. You need to explain what your results mean. Just saying that they are different from other people's results is not enough. You need to explain why that's useful. And the reader needs to be able to understand, or you need to make it clear to the reader what they should understand. They might not be clear, they might not be the experts in the area that you are, and they need direction. But importantly, as I've said here at the end, is be realistic. If you are not realistic, people will be confused. They might not follow your work. They also might mistrust your work. And it can cause problems in the future and with your career, sadly. So be clear about what you have achieved. Here's an example where the authors have been honest about what they achieved and interesting, and they've been speculative. Speculation is a good idea. It draws people in. It's exciting. But they're honest about their speculation, and they are honest about what they will do next. That's another thing you can include here is we have this result. The next thing we will research is a more refined version of this study, or we have discovered this subject is a dead end, we'll move on to another. The final section of your written work here will be conclusions. Within your conclusions, you should summarize your paper. You should explain the wider significance of your work. As mentioned above, the audience might not know, the reader might not know, so you as the author need to direct the reader in the right area so they understand the point of your work. Again, be realistic. If you're unrealistic, people won't believe you and they won't follow your work. And the final section of any paper, obviously the final section of written work is the conclusion to the actual final section, is the references. Now the references are very, very, very important. This is another reason I see papers rejected a lot, is where the references are not appropriate or they're not from trusted sources. So things you should make sure you do. You should make sure your references are from trusted sources. Avoid things like Wikipedia and non-reviewed sources, although not always, but generally do avoid things like that. If you use something, if you used the results, if you used a piece of knowledge, if you used a table, if you quoted, if you used an equation, reference it, always. If in doubt, reference. Never, if you use someone else's work and don't reference it, this can cause big problems. And it should, the point of the reference, or the references, whilst keeping you honest, is also to allow the reader to understand your work. We mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned in the introduction that you need to introduce the context of your work. The references can help to do that. It should allow the reader to understand the subject, read around the subject, understand why you've done your work, and understand your work itself. And finally, in references, avoid unnecessary ones. As I said, it's better to err on the side of caution, and if you're not sure, do reference something. But too many references can be misleading and confusing for referees and for readers. So you don't need to reference, if you're talking about gravity, you don't need to reference Isaac Newton, but you do need to reference the latest work on accelerometers in a study on gravity sensing, for example. So you have written your paper, you have submitted your paper. What can you do after submission to help your cause, make sure that, or help to ensure that your work is fairly treated and reviewed and possibly accepted? Firstly, you'll be communicating with editors. So editors are usually volunteers. They're not paid, at least not very much. They have their own jobs and they're acting as editors for the good of the community. So be polite. They're generally happy to help. And so you can ask them about their journal. You can also ask them about your paper within reason. The other important communication you will have is with the editorial office, perhaps with the editor, is responding to reviewer comments. Now, reviewer comments will be, or reviews will be blind, so you won't know who the reviewer is, but the comments will be sent to you, and you need to remember when a reviewer is judging your work, they are generally trying to help to improve your work. It's not personal. It's genuine help, or it's a genuine attempt to help with the author's work. So, when you receive comments, take them in, consider them sensibly, and respond to the comments point by point. So, if you receive a decision which involves a revision or rejection, you can respond to those comments and include those your answers when submitting a revised paper. Always include those answers and do it point by point. Reviewers appreciate it. It'll endear you further to the people involved and also give you a better chance of being accepted if you answer honestly. However, you don't have to agree with the reviewers. Not always. Reviewers can make mistakes, editors can make mistakes. But you need to be clear and honest about why you disagree. Don't be angry, but be clear. On that note, you may receive a reject decision, which you may disagree with. However, on average, around 75% of all papers in academic publishing are rejected. That's a lot of papers. So don't worry. You're not alone in having a paper rejected. And it may be that the journal just wasn't right for you and you need to find another journal. You can always appeal a reject decision. If you do think you can reject a decision, be polite, as mentioned before, and answer point by point. And also, importantly, you can ask the editor of the journal for advice. You could ask, okay, my paper was rejected. I don't agree. Here's why. What do you think I should do? It may be they say, okay, you should resubmit your paper. I agree with you. Or they could say, well, I still think there are problems, but I can recommend another journal for you to submit to that you may have better luck with. As I said, ask for advice, answer point by point, and be polite. And don't take it personally, because it's a competitive world, and there may well be a home for your work. On the note of rejection, we move on to another thorny subject of ethics. I've mentioned the same thing twice at the beginning here, which is do not plagiarize other people's work, and do not plagiarize other people's work. This doesn't happen often, of course, but it does happen. And if it's found out, and it will be found out, it's a big problem. So by plagiarize, we mean copying. You need to make sure that all authors have agreed to the submission of your paper. So don't include anyone's name on the paper where they haven't been involved and they haven't agreed to be involved, to be named. That again will be found out and cause a problem. Make sure, as I mentioned with references, make sure you reference everything you use. As I said, if you use it, reference it. Do not falsify results. There have been a few major cases of this, but there are also minor cases I see where it's quite clear the author has made claims for experimental results which are not true. Now, you can get away with this for a while, but it won't last. The problem certainly with plagiarism, lying about authors and falsifying results, is that can end careers, which is a shame, because nobody usually goes out to deceive, but you have to be quite careful. If you use someone else's work, even if you quote it, that could be viewed as plagiarism unless you reference that work. So always be clear that you're referencing, make sure that your work is your own, and if you borrow someone else's work, seek permission and reference. Finally, do not try to influence editors or reviewers. It won't work again. That can lead to serious problems in careers and won't do the author any favors in the long run. More information can be found at the website here, where it can give you advice on issues of plagiarism, falsification, and other slightly more sophisticated or advanced ethical problems in publishing. Okay, so in summary, we have discussed the subjects in engineering which are particularly interesting at the moment. There's a wide range of them. Here at SAGE we publish in all of those areas. It's very exciting. With that in mind, with your subject, you need to choose your journal carefully. Is it the right journal for you for scope reasons or for impact factor reasons? In writing your paper, there are three major things I would like you to take away, which is give your work context. Make sure that the reader can understand why you have done what you have done. Make sure the reader can understand how you did what you did. And then make sure the reader understands why what you found out is useful and important. And the very final thing I would say is be honest. Always be honest about your work, why it's interesting. Be honest in your dealings with editors, be honest in your dealings with the wider community in terms of plagiarism, and make sure that you give your work the best opportunity it can have for publication, because I'm sure it will be interesting and be useful somewhere. So, and yeah, we have here a slide detailing the resources available from SAGE. We have the open access portal here, and gives you an overview of the open access options available at SAGE. And you can also access the Chinese Author Gateway for advice and help on authors around China and around the world, in fact. And yeah, that is it from me. I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. I hope it was useful. As I said, the one thing to take away is understand and explain your work's context. And hopefully I look forward to seeing some of your submissions to journals I work on. Thank you very much. I should hand.
Okay. Thank you, James. We actually have received several questions. I will tell you one by one, and you can give some answers. The first one is that how should we draft the paper titles to draw readers' attention? Do you have any tips?
Yes. Not too long and not too short. So there's no, for example, there's often a temptation to include the word novel in the title, and it's unnecessary. So never say a novel method to calculate the Fourier transform of a function. Always just say a method to calculate. People will assume the work is novel. If you've used a particularly interesting material or a particularly interesting method, include it in the title. But always, I would say, ensure the title is no more than 15 words long. If it's longer than that, then people won't read it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next question is, do you recommend to submit papers to open access journals, and why?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think yes. If you have the funding to pay for open access, I think it's a good idea. Because in principle, your work will be more accessible to more people. If your work is behind a subscription paywall, fewer people will be able to see it. So in principle, more people will be able to see your work if it's submitted to an open access journal. However, you have to pay. And I think in principle, yes, I would advise it, but circumstances can be.
Okay, thank you. The next question. When we submit a paper, different journals have different format requests. It could be very hard for Chinese authors. So how should we avoid rejection because of the format issues?
Okay, so most journals, I hope, have details about that in author guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to the journal's webpage, it should say have an information for authors section, and this will give the details on how it should be formatted, be it single column, double column, how the references should be done, what font, things like that. That and the length limits, that will be available on any good journal's website. If you're unclear as well, you can always email the journal itself and ask for advice.
Yeah.
If it's a good journal, they will be able to advise you.
Okay, thank you. I think we still have time for one more question, so it will be the last one.
Okay.
The question is, if my submission is rejected by the first journal I choose, such as if I submit my paper to SAGE, one of the SAGE journals, will the editor be able to suggest other proper journal if my paper was rejected?
Yes. So it's unlikely the editor will suggest another journal straight away. So it may be, so I often will make if I reject a paper, I will think perhaps it's appropriate for a different journal, and I will include that in the rejection email. And then there are automatic transfers available to other SAGE journals. However, often that decision won't be made. But if your paper is rejected, you can email the editorial board, being polite, and say, or the editor, and say, thank you for your review of my work. Are there any journals you would recommend I submit my work to? And then, if they're a good editor, and I hope they are here at SAGE, and I've met plenty around the world, they will be able to recommend something. If you are resubmitting or submitting to another journal, and your work has already been reviewed by another journal, or previously reviewed, it's a good idea to include the review comments you received from the first journal you submitted to, and your reply to those comments. It's considered a good idea. It speeds up peer review process. It gives people a good idea of your work, and it's considered very important.
Yeah, good to know. Thank you so much.